Hello everybody and welcome to another Panelino Bambino video. Today we're going to be doing sort of a tier list, more of just talking about characters because Radiant Dawn is weird. So if you know anything about Radiant Dawn, you know that it's split up into parts and a lot of characters are only available for certain parts or even certain chapters. We did a tier list of the Dawn Brigade section of the game, and that tier list, outside of some pretty crazy units you get late during part 1, was pretty straightforward. This tier list, not so much. Part 2 is probably the most, disjointed part of the game. There's really, no training of units here. There's no, central main character like Micaiah or Ike. Um, it's just kind of some random units for every chapter. There's a few, Brahm and Nephany that are used in a lot of the chapters, but doing, a tier list for this section of the game, don't really know how you do it. I have the characters sort of divvied up with how I think they are in this portion of the game. But again, the amount of some of these characters are only available for a chapter, right? Or two. So, in any case, what we're going to be doing today is more of just talking about characters rather than a tier list, because I did a tier list for the Dawn Brigade. I want to do a tier list for the Grail Mercenaries, maybe some other stuff for part 4. So, let's get part 2 out of the way, I guess. So, we'll start with our S tier. I think the best characters of the part. I think the best character is Joffrey. Just another thing here. I'm going to be including, just like what I did with the Dawn Brigade, where I included their Part 3 chapters, I'm going to be including the Crimean Knights Part 3 chapter for this. So I think that bumps up Joffrey quite a bit. But again, not really a tier list. Doesn't really matter where he is. Joffrey is extremely good. He is by far your best unit in the Crimean Knights chapter of Part 2. He can pretty much solo that chapter. And then in Part 3, he's basically the only unit that's actually good in that chapter. I would highly recommend using the Master Crown you get. You can't sell them in these games, and he can actually still be fairly useful in Part 4, not that that really matters for this, but yeah, by the time you get around to that Part 3 chapter, a lot of the units in the Crimean Knights have fallen off, but Joffrey, especially with the Master Crown, will not have. He's also, as I said, really good in that first chapter. You also get the Crimean Knights on the final chapter. They're not very useful, but Joffrey is still your best unit during that, so really, really good unit. Highly recommend using the Master Crown. He's awesome. Then I also have Leanne. You put your dancer in S. She's available on, I think, 3 chapters, which is actually pretty high in comparison to a lot of these characters. So she's good. Dancers are good. Then I have Har, who for the entire game is 100% the best character. But most of that comes from how good he is in Part 3. He is really good in Part 2, which is why I have him as high as I do. But he's only available for about half of Chapter 1, which he's awesome on, and for the final chapter, which he's also awesome on. But that availability is pretty low. Yeah, he's amazing. I'll probably talk about Har more when I talk about the mercenaries and that section of the game. I will say, you can immediately see how good he is. He can dominate the first chapter, and then the last chapter he can actually kill Ludwig. He can actually kill the boss if you need him to. It's a really, really strong unit. Great class, great stats. You can't really grow him at all here, so he's a bit slow, but that only really matters for offensive potential. He's still amazing on that chapter. Then we have Brahm and Nephany, who are sort of the main characters of this portion of the game. Not narratively, of course, that's probably Alencia, but as far as chapters you get them on, Brahm and Nephany have actually their own chapter along with Heather, and then they're on a couple of different chapters. Out of these two, Brahm is definitely the stronger of the two characters, at least during this portion of the game. Brahm is actually amazing. He can hit pretty hard, but he takes hits extremely well, which is really what you want. You really want bulk. On the first chapter, you get them. He's basically the only way you can actually kill the boss of that chapter. Both Heather and Nephany can't really do much of anything. So he's amazing. He can do great on the tunnel chapter. He can do great on the final chapter. He's really, really strong. Nephany, on the other hand, is necessary, which is probably the best compliment I can give her, because she's not particularly strong. Part of her problem is that she comes with a steel great lance as opposed to a steel lance, and that weighs her down quite a bit. And that's a huge problem because she's pretty reliant on her speed stat. She doesn't take hits particularly well. Her damage output is okay, mostly because of the steel lance, but her hit is pretty terrible, especially if her biorhythm is low. And yeah, she can't double because of it. So she is okay and is kind of useful later when you can equip killer or steel lance or something on her, but early on she is necessary, but not very strong, not like Brahm. Kieran is basically the only other good Crimean Knight, if we're being honest. I mean, everyone looks good, at least at the first part of that first chapter, but especially when you get into part 3, Kieran is at least still fairly strong. No one is anywhere near as good as Joffrey, but Kieran is pretty useful on both chapters, I would say, because basically every other Crimean Knight sucks. So I think Kieran is actually a pretty solid character, even though obviously those recruitment times are particularly good. I think he's like level 11 or something too, so you could potentially Master Crown him. I don't know why you would, but if you don't want to do Joffrey, I don't know, maybe Joffrey's already strong enough. Maybe you could do some strat where like Kieran plus Joffrey, Kieran Master Crown is nice. I can't imagine that would be good, but I don't know. But he is pretty good. Then there's Nalucci. Nalucci's a fun little character. I think he's pretty solid. He's in like 3 of the chapters. He has extremely good speed, along with his extremely good HP, and I think his defense is okay, but his avoid coupled with his really good HP makes him pretty much immortal, if not for like bows and crossbows, especially crossbows. His speed means that his offensive potential is pretty good. I don't like Laguz in this game at all, as I've already talked about, and I will talk about more with the mercenaries. But Nalucci is pretty useful. He's a pretty good pala stats. Alencia is extremely neglected. You only get her for the first chapter and the last chapter, but she gets physic by the last chapter, which is pretty nice. She has really good mobility, being a decent class. Yeah, she's actually the only person that could heal of any of these units. Now, healing isn't particularly important in this game, given how good vulneraries are, but yeah, she's a pretty good unit. She's pretty useful during this part of the game. Marcia is okay. She's probably the next best of the Crimean Knights, but she's just okay during part 1. She's the only Crimean Knight that actually appears on a different chapter, other than maybe Khalil, if you want to count her. Given that she appears in the final chapter, but she's not very useful on that chapter, and she's not very useful in the part 3 chapter. She is pretty good at getting to burning villages, but bonus experience from the villages is not particularly useful, and you only lose if they all blow up or disintegrate or burn down. So she's not very good, but she can offer at least a little bit of combat. Lucy only appears on 1 chapter. She's really good on that chapter, although she is a bit frail. Yeah, she has a silver sword and really good speed. Can deal lots of decent damage. So she's really nice on that 1 chapter. For the 1 chapter you get her. I also think she's a decent Master Crown user for later on in the game, especially considering she'll usually wind up on like Tabarn's team and can be okay, especially with the speed the way that it is. She can double, but that's sort of a later in the game thing. Then we have Khalil, who you don't actually get until the end of part 2, and then she also appears on the Crimean Knights chapter in part 3. Now she can't heal, because Sages can't heal. Magic is pretty mediocre in this game. She does get Meteor, which is kind of cool, and can be very useful for part 3, and is pretty good, or sorry, part 2, and is pretty good at defending the fortress at the end of part 2. But she's a pretty mediocre character throughout the couple of chapters you get her. Heather, it's weird to give you a rogue during a section of the game where there basically are no chests to open. There's pretty much no chests throughout the whole game. There's a few on the Dawn Brigade and a few later. And unfortunately, a rogue just means you have kind of crappy Swordmaster stats, and you have to use knives and daggers, which are just weaker than every other weapon class. She can offer a little bit of combat, and she's, fairly bulky in her avoid, but she's pretty weak. Danvid or Devdan, I'm not sure. I think Danvid is the one in the other game, so it's Devdan. I don't know. Not really sure. Whatever his name is. He can offer decent combat with the knights. I mean, he's worse than Kieran, I think worse than Marcia, but even by part 3 he can still sort of take hits okay and deal out some damage. So he's a decent little unit. Not spectacular for sure, but he's okay. And then we have Makalov. Makalov is pretty bad. Everyone looks pretty good at the start of the part 2 Crimean Knights chapter, but he'll fall off pretty quick. And yeah, Makalov is unfortunately just pretty much a growth unit in a part of the game where you can't be a growth unit. And then we have Astrid, who's the ultimate growth unit, even having Paragon, but she is absolutely terrible. I think Astrid is one of the worst characters in the entire game. She can basically offer no or little combat immediately in part 2, and by part 3, she can basically do nothing. Again, there's just no room to grow these characters. The only nice thing about Astrid is that you can take off her Paragon when you get her in part 3, but that's you know, who cares? She's absolutely terrible. Like I said, I think along with like Meg and like Fiona, she's probably the worst character in the whole game. She's quite bad. So yeah, as I said at the top of the video, not much of a tier list, just kind of talking about them. I figured this would fit in nicely, but part two is just really weird. Again, it's really fragmented. All the units here outside of like I guess like Astrid and Makalov are actually pretty useful as combat units throughout. But again, you're not really like growing any of these characters outside of like maybe Nephany and Braum. And none of these chapters are particularly difficult. Like the Nephany and Braum's first chapter, I think, can be kind of tough, especially with how frail Nephany is. But like most of this part two is pretty straightforward. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. As I said, I think next we're going to be doing the mercenaries. That should be a little bit more interesting. And I'll see you in the next one.